hello everyone online. My name is Hannah K. Grabowski. I use they, them pronouns. I am a PhD candidate in gender studies at Arizona State University. I'm also affiliated with our disability studies program. And I am really honored to be one of UVit's visiting scholars for their fellowship. So I will be returning to campus in about 3 weeks to work in the archive. If any of you are local, I would love to talk to you. This weekend is actually my first in Canada ever. Yes, I really enjoy it. As an accessibility statement, I will share a visual description of myself, and I will do my best to share visual descriptions of any significant images on the slides I present. So, as I mentioned, I am a short, feminine presenting person wearing a red and black plaid dress. I have long brown curly hair that is somewhat tied up and gold framed glasses. I do not have printed copies of my presentation, which I think is a valuable step for accessibility, but I don't always read verbatim for my papers, but I'm happy to share my notes with anybody afterwards. My interest in gender euphoria as a broad concept started by witnessing conversations on Twitter and Instagram around 5 years ago. Most of it was memes, but there was a lot of sincere and deeply affective threads. So as someone interested in archives, the first thought was to just do a simple search of the phrase on the Digital Transgender Archive website. On the screen are 3 examples of references to gender euphoria in newsletters I found with that simple search. The first on the left is on the front page of a 1997 issue of the Chicago Chapter Tribune. The highlighted section is a sentence that says, "You probably also know that there is no agreement among the experts about the root cause of our gender euphoria, because likely there's no singular answer." And I agree. The top right is also from Chicago in 1998 issue, where the writer Kiki is describing the difference between dysphoria and euphoria. And the bottom right is from a 1983 issue of Metamorphosis. But what caught my attention, again with that very simple search, was an almost complete digitized collection of a newsletter titled Gender Euphoria from San Antonio, Texas, spanning 8 volumes between 1987 and 1999 with over 1,300 pages of content, a lot of PDFs. And there's a few issues missing, the first 2 and maybe 1 here or there, but it's a lot of pages. It was given its title after a naming competition. It was originally called Triple T News. The change to gender euphoria was attributed to the first editor, Janice, and a quote by Virginia Prince. A year later, Janice actually mentioned in a newsletter that although they saw the phrase gender euphoria as, quote, exclusive domain, the term was catching on with other newsletters and they took it as a compliment. It was also known as the Journal of the Bolton and Park Society. The group was led by a couple, Cynthia and Linda Phillips, and the group described themselves as a peer support and social group for TV-TS, assumed to mean transvestite and transsexual folk, but also their families and their friends. Even though the actual writing in the Gender Euphoria newsletter rarely uses that phrase to directly label lived experience, do I have to admit the people?
Oh, no, they will.
Okay, great. Apologies for that interruption. So even though they don't actually use the phrase within a lot of their writing, it's just the title, I just kind of became attached to the whole publication. Partially, I think, is because I hold phenomenology very close to me as a theory, a method, and ethic in a way. A short synopsis is phenomenology is the study of embodied lived experience. So I am more interested and invested in descriptions and stories of gender euphoria rather than attempts to define it and operationalize it. On this next slide on the right, you'll see an example of a front page of an issue of Gender Euphoria. This particular one is from January of 1990. This work is the basis of my forthcoming dissertation, which draws inspiration from Marika Seafor, Sarah Ahmed, and C. Riley Snorton, and uses affect theory with phenomenology to explore how experiences of gender euphoria by trans adults have been documented in newsletters between the 1970s and 1990s in US and Canada, and how it can be understood as a theoretical concept that challenges and goes beyond discourse that's exclusively on gender dysphoria. It is worded on the slide a little different. It says, what do these experiences, expressions, descriptions, and references of gender euphoria offer to understand it as a theoretical concept and social phenomenon? Now, dysphoria and euphoria as lived experiences and theories are not mutually exclusive nor oppositional, but I do think that research that centers euphoria as a concept is needed to paint a more detailed, holistic, and nuanced understanding of trans life. And I purposefully am not going to define either dysphoria or euphoria for you, which some may find frustrating, but I want you to think of what those words evoke for you personally. These questions are significant because research on gender euphoria has not taken an archival or phenomenological approach before. Most research on gender euphoria has been quite contemporary, really in the last 5 years, and are qualitative interviews with young adults on college campuses. I'm still about a year away from defending and graduating, so I do not have conclusive thoughts on the entire project. But today I would like to share an overview of and some preliminary reflections on what I have learned about the specific San Antonio newsletter. And I'm also still meditating on when and how I'll share personal details of the writers I encounter with, so you won't hear me identifying many names today. I don't find newsletters to be as much of a precarious object in comparison to, let's say, personal correspondence that's acquired in an archive, because newsletters were meant to be published, but their audience their intended audience is different than the one of my dissertation, so I'm still drawing my personal trans ethic of care. So more about the Journal of the Bolton and Park Society. I'll start with some general context. The first few issues averaged around 12 pages, but they were folded in half like a zine. About 2 years in, they started to generate more content and moved to a standard full-page spread like you saw on the slide before, and were about 8 pages. But in their last couple years, they would go up to almost 20 pages of content. They were pretty much monthly and then started to go every other month. An individual issue of Gender Euphoria would feature reflections on community events and meetings since the last publication, poetry, reprints of popular comics, advice columns, fictional short stories, movie and product reviews, recommendations for psychiatrists, hairstylists, you name it. Even international events and other newsletters that they could subscribe to through contacting Gender Euphoria and the Society. On the slide, I've clipped some of the reoccurring sections that they've had throughout the years, and you can see that the majority are written by the founders and part-time editors, Cynthia and Linda Phillips. So the newsletter had trouble recruiting writers of any genre, specifically for new content. They often republished things that were in other newsletters and then republished their own content throughout the years. And that contributed to it dissolving in 1999, in addition to funding issues and the internet making more gains as a place of community forum compared to more tangible in-mail newsletters. Within the gender expansive community, which the writers of this publication often call Gender World, which I will be using from now on, I love it, the newsletter catered mostly to cross-dressers and then secondarily trans women. Cross-dressers at the time seemed to really lead the conversation in San Antonio and were at times pretty exclusive of those who chose to, quote, permanently transition and seek any type of surgery. There were also moments that they explicitly distanced themselves from queer sexuality and that community. Writers often describe themselves and their peers as girls and ladies, and they kind of reserved the word woman more often to describe their cisgender spouses who were very present in the writing and actually writers themselves a lot of the time. The use of ladies carries with it a politic of respectability and also Southwestern etiquette. For example, at their largest annual event, which I'll speak a little bit more about in a minute, guests had to agree to the rules and spirit of the group, which included the following. While at the tea party, you will be expected to conduct yourselves as the ladies you appear to be. Since we don't want to spoil anyone else's efforts, we will allow no visible facial hair, either in or out of the party. We are serious about this. Last year, a guest shaved off a beard he had worn for 14 years. We don't know who is happier, the Tea Party committee or the lady in question. This particular statement was cited for safety reasons, but San Antonio was generally conservative compared to urban spaces at the time. I share this not to discredit the work that the group was doing for their community, but at times I think we center progressive places like New York City and San Francisco in historical conversations, and one might assume that stories throughout the continental US and the Southwest are comparable when they often aren't. So the main legacy, I would say, of the Bolton and Park Society as a whole that was documented in newsletters was their Texas Tea Party. They held film screenings, dinners, local excursions, conference-like seminars on everything from makeup, poetry, book signings, healthcare. The first party was in 1989, 2 years after the newsletter started. There was about 150 attendees, 25 different states, and about 25 of those people were spouses, assumed to be cisgendered women. In 93, we know that attendance rose upwards of 360 from 30 states and 4 countries, but soon after they stopped publishing figures, they cited that there were gender wars over the biggest and best events. But we do know in 97 that attendance was actually restricted because they started meeting capacity at all the hotels, and that was the same year that Leslie Feinberg was the keynote speaker. So the newsletter would give testimonies and reviews of the party, and some would submit full editorials on their experience. And I would like to end with the story featured in the newsletter about one of the Texas Tea Parties. It's one that describes gender euphoria in a way, but it is complicated by how it is situated in a column that excludes and offends others in the trans community. The writer describes some people as freaks and perverts in the paragraph directly before what I'm going to quote. At the last tea party, I ended up in a rather long discussion about being transgendered with a lady and her 3 teenage daughters. When they were first thrust into close proximity, it was obvious they were very uncomfortable with being guests in a hotel full of us. The icebreaker was when they asked the desk clerk if she knew any good stores for a prom dress. I piped up and gave them directions to 2 of the better stores I knew of, and the plus and minuses of each. This turned out to be a great icebreaker. The mom said that because of the way I dress, she had to take the recommendations as being excellent. We sat down and began talking. Naturally, they had a lot of questions, and even the girls got really involved in the conversation and asked some good questions. After about an hour in, the mom said because she thought my taste in clothes was better than hers, would I be interested in going shopping with them and help pick out dresses for the girls? It was clear that they were in no way self-conscious to be seen with me. Fortunately, I am fairly passable. Well, I broke out my black belt in shopping and off we went. When the shopping spree was over, they had killer outfits at great prices, and they had an understanding and appreciation of who we are. I got hugs from them, and they had their pictures taken with me. They asked me to have dinner with them, but unfortunately, I was having to leave the tea party early for another trip. So I had to decline their offer, a positive experience for everyone. Wonder how it would have gone if I had played the trans in-your-face game. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you. So my name's Evan Vipond. I'm a PhD candidate in gender, feminist, and women's studies at York University. And I'd like to start first with a land acknowledgement. So I'm located in Takaranto, also known as Toronto, which in Mohawk means where there are trees standing in the water. Today, Takaranto is covered under Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties. It is the traditional territories of many First Peoples, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, a treaty made between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee, where nations entered into an agreement to protect the land and reasonably care for its resources in harmony together. So Original Plumbing is a trans male quarterly zine co-created and co-edited by Amos Mack and Rocco Kayotis, who is also known as Catastrophe. Over the course of a decade, Original Plumbing, also referred to as OP, released a total of 20 issues, beginning with the bedroom issue in fall 2009 and concluding with the issues issue in winter 2019. Beyond print, OP sold merchandise such as apparel and stickers and hosted events for transmasculine communities in the United States and Canada, including launch parties for its latest issues. In May 2019, selections from each issue were compiled and published in a 400-page anthology entitled Original Plumbing, The Best of 10 Years of Trans Male Culture. OP holds significant historical and cultural importance as a T for T or trans for trans publication made by trans men and for trans men, and thus serves as a time capsule of Anglo-American trans male culture in the 2010s. Each issue of OP features thematic photo shoots, in-depth interviews, creative writing, and personal narratives reflecting a wide range of transmasculine individuals. While those featured across the 20 issues of OP are in no way representative of the vast experiences of trans men and transmasculine people around the globe, the zine serves as an entry point for theorizing new norms of transmasculinity and trans male cultural production in the West. Original plumbing is a term commonly used by trans men to refer to their genitals that pushes back to the cisnormative standards of male embodiment and the assumption that most trans guys pursue bottom or lower surgery. Rather than prescribing what it means to be a trans man, OP exemplifies that there is no right way to transition or embody masculinity and embraces instead the fluidity, complexity, and diversity of transmasculine subjectivities, from dandies, fairies, and fags to jocks, bears, and leather daddies. As a by and for trans male zine, Original Plumbing serves as a fruitful site for theorizing transmasculinity's community formation and cultural production. Cultural production is often paradoxical, both reflecting and producing the subjects that it represents. Through its production and circulation, OP produces and reproduces the trans male subject and transmasculine community that it seeks to reflect. Speaking to this paradox, Emi Vahapisi explains that OP postulates an identity, i.e. sameness, among trans men, and conveys the impression of bringing similar but separate individuals together in a kind of community based on a shared identity, while in fact, it is in fact creating this very identity. On the other hand, the trans male community Original Plumbing claims to represent already exists. This community is constituted by OP's contributors and readerships, neither of which could predate its formation. I was in my early 20s and had just come out as trans when Original Plumbing was first released. As a young white transmasculine person with invisible disabilities, I came to understand myself both in relation and opposition to the representations of transmasculinity within Original Plumbing. OP also exemplifies the tensions between individual and collective representation and identity formations. Carter, Getzi, and Sala note that there is an inherent tension between the construction and representation of individual trans subjects, such as the individuals represented in OP, and the making and representing of trans collectivities, specifically the making and representation of a trans male community. For underrepresented communities, the representation of individuals extends beyond the subject to the collective. When OP was first published in 2009, there was very little public awareness of trans issues, and trans masculine representation in mainstream media and popular culture was practically non-existent. Fast forward 10 years, and trans people are more visible than ever. This increase in visibility, however, has also led to hypervisibility, which can lead to increased violence and premature death. As visibility has increased, so has anti-trans violence, which continues to threaten and claim trans lives, particularly the lives of Black trans women and trans feminine people of color. Despite the increasing visibility, representation of trans masculine subjects in popular culture and mainstream media is still limited, and often centers the white, straight, masculine, middle-class, non-disabled trans male subject. This limited representation of trans male subjects comes to stand in for the collective, homogenizing trans masculine subjectivities by obscuring differences. Through the lens of transnormativity, critical trans scholars have theorized how trans masculine representation in mainstream media and popular culture uphold a medical model of transition that seeks to replicate cis male embodiment and serves to reinforce the boundaries of the sex-gender binary. OP offers a counterpoint to transnormativity by demonstrating that trans men's experiences of transition and subjectivities cannot be reduced to a singular narrative or subjectivity. While the term trans male was employed throughout OP's calls for writers and models, the interpretations of what it means to be trans male by OP readers and contributors were far more expansive than the narrow representation of trans men reflected in mainstream media. While interviewing Amos Mack in fall 2020, I noted that from the very first issue, OP did not define what it means to be trans male. I asked Amos if he had always envisioned the zine this way, or if it had broadened based on the contributors and readership. He responded, "I knew going into OP that we were not there to tell anyone what a trans man was or was not, meaning we were not going to tell people some A to Z way that made you a trans man. Rocco and I both knew that trans male experiences were almost undefinable, and that there are many versions of transness as there are trans people. The last thing I'd want to do is only show one version of trans masculinity in print over and over. It was intentional to focus on how diverse trans guys are and were in terms of presentation, sexuality, personal style, relationships to their own bodies and the world around them. I didn't want OP in some small way to show our readers that there was a right or wrong way to be anything. This expansion includes a proliferation of trans subjectivities and vocabularies, marked by a shift in terminology toward plurality, for instance, trans masculinities and trans femininities, and other ways of being that reject the limits of the sex-gender binary. OP reflects these cultural shifts by broadening the category of trans man to include trans masculine people who may not wholly identify as male. Amos Mack recalls, early on in OP, we used the term trans male identified. Then I sometimes would be intrigued to learn from people while I was photographing them that they were actually more genderqueer or trans masc identified, not necessarily FTM. Then I realized I couldn't police who should be in the magazine. If they knew what the magazine was about and reached out to participate in it, clearly they were trans masc enough in their own identity to connect with and want to be part of OP. The transnormative discourse of being trans enough has been taken up by critical trans scholars and pushed back on by community members across various platforms, most notably Tumblr. OP challenges this discourse by showcasing trans masculine of center individuals who embody masculinity, exude femininity, or embrace androgyny, affirming trans masculinity in all its modes and possibilities. Moreover, while the earlier issues of OP focused more heavily on medical transition, later issues highlight other aspects of trans masculine life, including work, fashion, schooling, family, entertainment, sports, activism, politics, and arts and culture. In shifting away from medicalization transition, OP reflects a desire by trans people to move beyond narratives of transition and celebrate all aspects of trans life.
5 minutes.
Thanks. While individual trans people may identify with or embody transnormative ideals, the privileging of a singular mode of transition and subject position results in a closed narrative that hinders the proliferation of other trans subjectivities and embodiments. Political theorist Alexis Shotwell's concept of open normativities, on the other hand, is useful for understanding how counter-narratives create new possibilities that challenge the disciplinary nature of hegemonic norms. While challenging one norm risks supplanting it with another, open normativities prioritize flourishing and tend toward proliferation, enabling new ways of being. OP moves away from the singularity of transnormativity towards open normativities, even as it reproduces new norms of transmasculinity, through showcasing trans men who exist outside the narrow confines of the white, straight, masculine, middle-class subject. In doing so, OP offers a less cohesive but more accurate and diverse representation of transmasculine embodiments and subjectivities. As a T for T trans male zine, OP resists the cisgender gaze, which too often fetishizes, sensationalizes, or pities the trans body, rejecting the impetus to make trans subjectivities and embodiments culturally intelligible to cisgender readers. Enacting instead what Jack Halberstam refers to as the transgender gaze, OP shifts the frame of cultural intelligibility away from cisgender norms and offers a more authentic and unmediated representation of trans men that speaks back to hegemonic masculinity. This is evidenced across the various photo shoots which contest and complicate cisnormative sexuality and embodiment. Many of the photo shoots and artworks featured in OP depict nudity and sexual imagery, making transmasculine bodies and sexualities knowable. In doing so, transmasculine subjects take ownership over their bodies and self-expression, acts that can be life-affirming and sustaining for both the subject and viewer. Representation can offer new ways of being, but it can also foreclose other possibilities and reproduce existing social hierarchies, as the way the group represents itself affects what kinds of trans lives can be imagined as possible and livable. While representation can make new futures possible, it often reproduces hierarchies of invisibility. Through erasures and omissions, certain lives, namely Black, Indigenous, racialized, poor, or disabled, remain unimaginable within the collective imaginary. As a form of T for T cultural production, OP resists the cisgender gaze and the singularity of a transnormative male subject. In doing so, it contributes to the proliferation of trans male embodiments and subjectivities and expands the cultural repertoire of trans masculinities. At the same time, through omission, OP contributes to the ongoing erasure and underrepresentation of certain transmasculine bodies, thus demonstrating the possibilities and limitations of cultural production for individual and collective representation. One of these noticeable omissions and erasures is trans persons living with disabilities, which has largely been, which trans scholarship has largely failed to engage with.
1 minute.
Thank you. The underrepresentation of disabled trans people exemplifies how community formations can be emancipatory for some and exclusionary for others, most notably those who are marginalized by multiple systems of oppression, such as race, class, disability, and citizenship. Nonetheless, Original Plumbing offers us an opportunity to look at a snapshot of transmasculine representation within the Anglo-American culture from 2009 to 2019. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. My name is Christopher Wolff. I'm a PhD student in the Humanities programs at Concordia University, which is located in Tiohtià:ke, colonially known as Montreal.
Excuse me, could you please point the microphone down?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I'll be thinking about that cylindrical object joke the whole day. So I'd like to note that the research project I'm about to present is very much still a work in progress and deals with very recent trans media history. There are folks at this conference and in this room today that are part of this history and will have fuller knowledge of parts of my research than I at this point do. And my presentation is very much an invitation to those folks to correct me if I've gotten something wrong. Well, I will probably get some things wrong, so please don't hesitate to do so. I'll start by talking about the scope of my thesis project about trans community newsletters. Where do I? Sorry.
No, that's okay, that's my fault. There you go.
Okay. Sorry about that. So my PhD thesis investigates the production and distribution of trans community newsletters in the US and Canada from around the early 1950s to the mid-1990s. I look at how English language newsletters were received by national and international audiences during a time when there were few other resources available for trans people, and what functions the newsletters served for the growing trans community. My research is twofold in that I study the newsletters themselves and that I will also speak to folks who were directly involved in producing these newsletters, either as editors, contributors, and/or readers. And in terms of defining trans identity for these newsletters, I use trans as an umbrella term, both being aware of the wide variety of experiences of gender diversity that can be encompassed by a broad definition of the term trans, and the fact that it is difficult to use current terms like transgender for people who back then had a different language or sometimes no language to describe themselves. And the newsletters were, in fact, a venue where terms of identity were introduced and negotiated over time. In terms of the research on this topic that already exists, there have been a number of scholarly articles on individual trans newsletters, but so far there has been no comprehensive study of the history of trans community newsletters that I know of, and there has also been no study of the international reach of these newsletters. The only quantitative study of trans publications I found so far is for German language trans newsletters, which naturally covers a smaller sample and shorter publication timeline. While there have been several books on US and Canadian gay and lesbian print media, these studies focus only on cis gay and lesbian publications and make virtually no mention of trans newsletters. And this despite archival collections like the one held at California State University that lists almost 200 different English language trans-created newsletters. My research, therefore, aims to document a part of trans media history that has been understudied until now. As mentioned, I'm still in the middle of this research project, and there are naturally some challenges to consider. Access to newsletters has sometimes been difficult since many publications have not been digitized and are only available at archives that I need to visit in person to look at them. Then there's the fact that even when including a list of all existing trans publications, the analysis must be limited to select newsletters in a project like this. And so I'm planning to concentrate on publications that demonstrably had an international audience, as well as a runtime of at least several years. I'm also considering subscriber numbers, though those do not always reflect the reach of a publication, since the newsletters were often passed around in the community. Yeah, in terms of the content of the newsletters, sometimes it can be challenging to verify some information, since the newsletter may be the only surviving record. And also the newsletters were, of course, created by people who already had a certain access to resources, which is, of course, not reflective of the whole trans community. And the newsletters naturally cannot ever be the full picture of discourses circulating in the community. So it seems that many newsletters followed a format that had already been established and took inspiration from existing newsletters for cis gays and lesbians. Previous research credits Lisa Bent's 1947 lesbian newsletter Vice Versa as establishing the format that later queer newsletters would follow, which, for example, includes like newsletter contents like news clippings, bibliographies, scientific research results, fiction and poetry, editorials, letters from readers, and personal ads. And over time, there were also advertisements for other resources and other publications to be found, as well as content reproduced from other newsletters. And in terms of information about medical and other scientific expertise, there is, of course, a reliance on cisgender professionals at first, which for trans publications actually seems to start to shift around the 1980s when community knowledge becomes more foregrounded. The main functions of these newsletters can be summarized under what Kate McKinney calls information activism, meaning education, research sharing, creating newsletters, networks of communication, as well as determining language and identity aspects, the last one being often drawing boundaries around who should be considered part of the community. And in the following, I'm going to be talking about a few select newsletters that had considerable influence in trans communities. Transvestia, edited by Virginia Prince, had an audience reaching as far as Canada, England, and Australia. The newsletter negotiated a cross-dresser or transvestite identity aimed at people assigned male at birth who viewed themselves as heterosexual, were often married, and desired to live out a feminine identity part-time, with their wives playing a crucial role in supporting this. This went hand in hand with an intentional distancing from transsexuality and homosexuality, letting subscribers claim a positive but private trans identity. However, Virginia Prince's own gender journey significantly complicated this narrative over time when she started living as a woman full-time. Apart from Prince's own shifting stance, there were always subscribers who pushed back against the narrow identity concept of transvestia. And so transvestia functioned most likely as an early source of information for people also with a stronger cross-gender identification than the magazine officially advocated. Previous research speaks of the audience of transvestia as a spectrum of gender variance and being part of a taxonomic revolution around identity terms, with debates conducted through transvestia playing an important role in it. The Erickson Educational Foundation newsletter was part of Reed Erickson's organization's outreach strategy to educate on issues related to transsexualism. It constituted an organizational venture for EEF and is only partially describable as a community newsletter, but nonetheless an important part of trans media history. The newsletter connected trans people to providers and to resources, disseminated info about trans peer support groups and programs, and subscribers were also able to get information about other newsletters and community organizations by writing to the EF. And for example, Rupert Rush, whose own newsletters I'll be talking about in a minute, found other Canadian trans activists in the early 1970s through reading the EF newsletter. The EF also solicited contact information for their medical referral list from newsletter readers, asking for recommendations for doctors. And so the newsletter was part of a larger conversation between the EF, trans people, and the cis professionals who worked with them. The newsletter was free and distributed widely, not just to trans people, but also to healthcare professionals, the media, etc., and did play a significant role in the work of EF in establishing a network of trans healthcare in the US and possibly elsewhere. Drag magazine, founded and edited by Lee G. Brewster of the Queen's Liberation Front, had, at least at the beginning, a more militant orientation, coming out in the climate of post-Stonewall and gay liberation activism, where editor and readers had to contend with cis gays and lesbians becoming increasingly antagonistic to the trans spectrum within queer activist circles. Drag magazine promoted a more fluid identity, despite labeling itself a transvestite publication, and was inclusive of the trans feminine spectrum, with no qualifying standards as to who could be part of the community. It therefore tried to unite the wider community, which is a divergence from other trans publications who were stricter with identity terms. Drag also had demonstrable international reach with readers in Germany, the UK, and France. And for example, German trans activist Gerd Südel felt inspired to create his own publication after a friend of his brought copies of Drag to Germany. And by Drag's own account, their mailing list had over 2,000 subscribers in 1972, and therefore a significant reach nationally as well as internationally. Times and Tissues was a Canadian newsletter produced by the group Transvestite à Montréal. The newsletter was coordinated and sometimes edited by a gay cis man named David Cassidy, since the TAM support group was run out of Gay Info Montreal. And so the newsletters proved that there was still support and collaboration between cis, gay, and trans people, even after the community started to splinter in the post-Stonewall decade. The group attracted a mix of self-described transvestites and transsexuals, and later formed another support group that was specifically for transsexual women. While the newsletter was strongly focused on a local audience, it reached beyond borders to the US and possibly other countries. There was French content in the newsletter, but it was mainly English and clearly more directed towards people speaking English within a Francophone province. This separation between resources for either English or French speakers is something that has continued in Montreal to this day, with separate organizations serving English and French trans people, and activism is often dominated by either one or the other group. Gender Review and Metamorphosis were two other Canadian newsletters founded and edited by Rupert Raj. Raj decided to start Gender Review in 1978 after reading the newsletter Renaissance, edited by Joanna Clogg and Jude Patton, whose J2CP organization continued the work of the Erickson Educational Foundation. And so there's really a lineage visible between many of these publications overlapping and succeeding each other, and there existed a contact network between trans media creators, with them contributing to each other's work and taking up successive advocacy and information sharing. While Raj's Gender Review was aimed at both MTFs and FTMs, and Raj transferred editorship of it to trans women after 1982, his Metamorphosis magazine was the first publication exclusively for trans men. His newsletters had subscribers around the world, and especially Metamorphosis seems to have laid the groundwork of negotiating identity aspects for trans men nationally and internationally, which of course were continued by Lou Sullivan and FTM. So Lou Sullivan founded what is probably one of the most well-known trans newsletters, using Rupert Raj's Metamorphosis mailing list to send out the first issue of FTM. Sullivan edited the newsletter until his passing in 1991, and then Jameson Green took over and stayed involved with FTM for many years after. And by spring 1994, FTM had over 600 subscribers in 17 countries. In recognition of the international network that had been created through the newsletters, the name was later changed to FTM International. But Lou Sullivan had already published reader letters from the UK and the Netherlands in 1989, showing that an international audience existed from the beginning. Sullivan's openness towards FTM identity set the tone for the newsletters, being inclusive of a wide variety of experiences. And Jameson Green has written in his book that learning about how others saw themselves was one of the big takeaways from the newsletters, which helped expand notions of FTM identity. This information just wasn't available elsewhere at the time, and through the newsletters, FTMs were able to connect with each other. Jameson Green has also written that the first FTM-focused internet bulletin board was established around 1992, which shows that the internet was beginning to become a resource for trans people in the early to mid-1990s, and that it would start to eclipse some of the newsletter functions as the decade went on. So many newsletters, of course, continued to publish even after the internet became a resource for trans people. This shows that they remained important for the community, even some functions like sharing resources and finding community were gradually replaced by the internet. But the success of magazines like Original Plumbing, like we just heard, shows that trans people continue to read print media that was addressed to their community well into the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elio Colavito. I said my own last name. I use he, they pronouns. I'm just going to do a quick description for everyone, for those who can't see. I am a little fluffy-haired, mulleted, trans mask white guy with some thick black glasses. I'm sitting against a white background. Very happy to be here today. I am actually joining from Takaranto, now called Toronto under Treaty 13. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of History with a collaborative specialization in sexual diversity studies at the University of Toronto. Let's do it. Dear Rupert, I'm sorry it's taken me 3 months to respond to your letter. I just finished your questionnaire. I don't know when I'll have phalloplasty. The insurance that I have now doesn't pay for it. If I can afford it and lose the necessary weight, I'll probably go to Dr. Forrester in Oklahoma. If I could, I'd go to Gilbert in Virginia. Have you talked to anyone who went with Virginia and has feeling in his penis? Everyone seems to have such serious complications. This is a short excerpt from a 4-page letter sent to Rupert Raj in 1989. Rupert Raj was born to East Indian and Polish immigrants in Ottawa, Ontario in 1952. And in 1971, at the age of 19, Raj took the steps to begin his medical transition from female to male and scheduled an appointment with the Harry Benjamin Foundation's endocrinologist, Dr. Charles Ihlenfeld. Since Raj was not yet 21, the age of majority in New York, his older brother had to provide consent. And it was there that Dr. Ihlenfeld administered Raj's first shot of testosterone. When Raj embarked on this journey, he had little support beyond connections to a few other trans folks across Canada and the US, and not for a lack of trying, but because a trans masculine community had yet to emerge. Despite this, Raj went on to have an incredible life as an activist, cultivating multiple opportunities to share resources with trans people around the world from the late 70s to the present. This paper focuses on those shared connections between primarily trans men across Canada and the US, as Raj and a handful of other activists forged the path for trans organizing, resource sharing, and community making in Canada and the US. Using correspondences between Raj and other trans men from his collection at the archives and other supplementary archives, I have traced the contours of trans masculine mutual aid and care work from the late 70s to the 90s. And I argue that alongside traditional forms of activism, mutual aid and care work provide a lens through which we can more clearly see the ways that trans life became more survivable and livable. In framing mutual aid, I'm inspired by Dean Spade, who thinks about the bold ways that ordinary people respond to the needs of their communities, how they share resources, and most importantly, make the world a little bit more survivable. It is this survival work done in conjunction with organizing that Spade calls mutual aid. I also turn to Hill Malatino, who thinks about a distinctly trans ethos of care, in which care has the power to heal in the wake of upheaval and transformation, and supports emergence into a radically recalibrated experience. For Malatino, collective ways of doing yield possibilities for trans survival and living. My work focuses on care beyond the clinic, the magic that trans people make to get people there and to support them after they leave. In 1978, Raj started an organization for trans people, including trans men and women, as well as cross-dressers, the Foundation of the Advancement of Canadian Transsexuals, or FACT. The organization also held a newsletter called Gender Review, a factual journal. The first issue of Gender Review was published in June of 1978 and included a list of FACT's goals, which aims to assist transsexuals through the most difficult period following the change in gender identity and to provide psychological, spiritual, and peer support to all transsexuals, irrespective of race, color, or creed. And Gender Review did just that. Raj published short medical literature reviews that offered trans-affirming views, including docs' claims sex switch operations are paying off and new evidence transsexuals are born, not made. And it was in Gender Review that Raj did some of his most foundational mutual aid, using the pages list of Gender Review to help trans people access hormone replacement therapy and other gender-affirming care. For readers that were not yet ready for these interventions or who still needed these tips, Raj published fashion tip guides that help trans men and women pass in public. Letters to the editor in 1980 from as far as Austin, Texas, Long Beach, California, and Port Moody, BC, praised the knowledge and resource sharing work that Raj committed in Gender Review. MJ from Austin claimed that Gender Review was most informative and helpful. It has helped me immensely and is certainly one of the best I've seen. FS from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, praised Raj's work under FACT, particularly for his work in sharing information about phalloplasty or the creation of a penis accessibility. With a subscription list across Canada and the US, Gender Review contained details and advertisements for trans-safe businesses, offering various kinds of gender-affirming care, like electrolysis treatments from Boston to Toronto. It was precisely this kind of work that made trans life more survivable and livable in the late 70s until 1982, which saw the beginnings of these care webs start to reach across the continent. It was in 82 that Raj, joining a handful of other trans men, recognized the need for trans masculine specific organizing and resource sharing efforts. At this time, 4 advocacy groups on behalf of trans men existed in the US. Mario and Becky Martino's Labyrinth Foundation's counseling services in Yonkers, New York, Johnny A's F2M in Tenafly, New Jersey, Jude Patton's Renaissance group in Santa Ana, California, and Jeff S's group in Southern California. These trans men served as gender networkers, resource sharers, and information brokers in their respective communities. And they supported the exchange of information from trans man to trans man, trans community to physicians, and from trans community to loved ones and allies. In 1982, collaborating with Mario Martino from Yonkers, New York, they researched, developed, and tried to market a penile prosthetic device as an alternative to phalloplasty. And this ultimately inspired the name and purpose of a new organization, the Metamorphosis Medical Research Foundation, or MMRF, by Raj. As an information broker and resource sharer, Raj founded the bi-monthly magazine Metamorphosis in February of 82. The magazine provided information on various aspects of female-to-male transsexuality written by Raj and others, clinical research, hormones, surgery, tips to effectively pass as male in public, and legal reform for trans people. Metamorphosis became the most important international magazine for FDMs in the 80s, with over 700 subscribers. Most of these subscribers were American, but there were also trans men from Canada, Australia, Yemen, and Tanzania who eagerly paid to get their hands on Raj's information and resources. And it's here in the 80s that these correspondences reveal Raj's immense contributions to trans masculine mutual aid. Jude Patton, the founder of Renaissance, undertook similar work. Patton started writing Renaissance, which published relevant medical information and resources accompanied by trans political and lifestyle pieces in 87. The correspondences in the archive serve as a site of knowledge exchange amongst trans masculine people, and a prime example comes from a trans man named Jim in December of 82, who writes from Southern California. Thanks for the phalloplasty referrals. I'll wait till your update because I won't be having my surgery for another year. I have already been accepted by Dr. Loeb's program, but I got my mastectomy elsewhere. I have a profound disrespect for Dr. Loeb and his so-called professional clinic. I found them to be heartless money grabbers, void of compassion. And this letter serves as a prime example of not only efforts to share resources with trans masculine people, but where these gender workers were able to collect valuable information about the quality of care from the places that they were connecting others to. These kinds of information were mobilized through the inclusion of a questionnaire that asks subscribers of Metamorphosis to disclose information about their experiences accessing gender affirming care. Responders included contact info for the clinics they reached, details about the kind of care they received and the quality of that care, as well as whether or not they would recommend that clinic or a specific doctor to other trans masculine people. And Raj would go on to use these questionnaires and open letters to share this information through his publications and direct correspondences with other people seeking help. In the mid-80s, these gender workers and information brokers began to speak directly to doctors offering gender-affirming care to see how they could better assist trans masculine people with navigating the complicated process of accessing hormone replacement therapy and gender-affirming surgeries. In some instances, doctors would hear of this work and write directly to provide insight. A letter from an endocrinologist in Salt Lake City, Utah, expressed interest in having his information circulated by Raj, saying that with a note from a doctor, I can help people accomplish what they want to. And Raj published this information about accessing gender-affirming care and Metamorphosis, using the information sent to him by trans people and doctors to help spread the word of opportunities around Canada and the US. He also corresponded with doctors to give suggestions on how to better talk to and treat trans patients, providing a doctor-patient guide sheet to any office that requested one. Doctors of the 70s to the early 2000s, and in many circumstances today, use what has been dubbed by trans studies scholars the wrong body model, in which trans subjects express feeling like they were born in the wrong body. Historians like Joanne Meyerowitz, Susan Stryker, and Jules Gill Peterson have written extensively about the ways that trans people have had to communicate specific internal feelings that meet this wrong body model, as well as specific desires for their transitions in order to obtain medical care. And a part of these mutual aid efforts included sharing common phrases and sentiments that trans masculine people should say at clinics, which often fell into the wrong body model. Phrases like, I was born in the wrong body, or I feel like a man trapped in a woman's body. And these kinds of suggestions were accompanied by other experience-based feelings to consider. In thinking about this mutual aid care work, it's obvious that these gender networkers and information brokers made the trans world a little bit more survivable. They were able to communicate this critical information that trans masculine people needed to align their identities with their bodies. But this mutual aid and care work went beyond survivability and fostered a trans masculine community and subculture. Correspondences between trans men and the publications of Gender Review, Metamorphosis, and Renaissance that sprung from these correspondences transcended the medicalization of transness towards a network of community support and kinship. And despite the success of these mutual aid and care webs, in 1988, Raj decided to close MMRF and end publication of Metamorphosis due to burnout. And if we look to Renaissance, the publication underwent several changes in format and name before patent ceased publication at some point in the early 2000s. Moving into the 90s, we see a shift away from resource-based information and towards social, political, and community education. The 90s really is the decade of the FTM support group, where across the United States, queer and trans organizers cultivated spaces for trans masculine folks to meet in person, often at queer and trans community centers, or really any space that they could find to host such events. These spaces, set up by the likes of the Ingersoll Jenner Center in Washington State, Lou Sullivan's San Francisco-based FTM, or the Gay and Lesbian AIDS Education Initiative in Philadelphia, hosted monthly or weekly meetups for trans men to discuss their specific needs, concerns, while making space for community connection and kinship making. These spaces hosted conversations about transition, coming out, dating, HIV/AIDS, safety, workplace and job security, among other relevant issues. Sometimes they were also just used as spaces to check in and connect with friends and community. These spaces became the foundation for access to information and community, supplemented by newsletters like Metamorphosis and Renaissance. And these spaces continued to operate in person, but largely moved online in the late 90s and early 2000s, where they were more accessible to trans men across different geographies and class backgrounds. The 90s also saw an increase in trans masculine writing being made available in the queer and trans press. And in the mid-90s, magazines like Transgender Tapestry started to host space for trans men to share resources and passing tips. Andy, a trans man based in Boston, wrote a couple of articles for Transgender Tapestry, sharing his own FTM passing tips for other vulnerable trans men. And in 1999, Andy took his expertise to the internet, putting the tips online at GeoCities, and with GeoCities' demise in 2009, it moved to its current home at ftmpassingtips.com. And so this mutual and care work, analyzed alongside other traditional activist efforts, reveals the complex community-making support work that can help explain the proliferation of trans communities across Canada and the US, and what it takes to survive in the coming crisis against anti-trans legislation. Ultimately, I'm of the opinion that this history does exactly what these gender networkers and information brokers did from the late 70s to the 2000s, which is make trans life a little bit more livable. Thank you.